there has to be like a place where it's understood, okay, we're going to try to hash it out here.
Mm-hmm.
And, that this is the place where that happens, and therefore this is the publication that should be paid attention to. That it's not just part of some generally undifferentiated content stream,
Mm-hmm.
but there's like, something happening there.
All right. Well, welcome to the Cutrone Zone again. This time, post-platypus convention. We're all still processing what we experienced. I'm glad to have you back on the Inflation YouTube channel, of course. And I guess I'll start with asking you, Chris, to debrief me after my debrief with Benjamin Studebaker yesterday. You said you'd gotten a chance to watch that. What were your thoughts?
Well, I guess I wanted to really focus on the issue of post-neoliberalism, since I've been banging that drum for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about the panel that I was on, the closing plenary, with Branko Markovic and Alex Higgins and Andrew Hartman on the left in the 21st century. And, my contention is that Trump has represented the emergence of post-neoliberalism, and this is really pitched against the way that the left usually sees him as a kind of ultra or hyper neoliberal.
Mm-hmm.
And so another term that we might consider is anti-neoliberal. So Trump is not anti-neoliberal, but he certainly has anti-neoliberal people in his coalition or in his administration, we could say.
Mm-hmm.
But that Trump himself is not anti-neoliberal, but he's post-neoliberal. And that really post-neoliberalism is something that we see emerging with both Bernie and Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes back to the 2008 economic crisis and the disappointment with the Obama administration.
Right.
Meaning Obama, in some ways, promised to be the first post-neoliberal president, but failed to be. And that brought forth both the Tea Party revolt by the Republicans and Occupy Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know that the left thinks that it has a monopoly on anti-neoliberalism, but of course it does not.
Yeah.
Right? So right-wing anti-neoliberalism, right-wing anti-capitalism, and in some ways very closely tied to supposed left anti-neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's been my contention for, a while now. That's why I always thought we needed to understand Bernie and Trump together, that you really
Mm-hmm.
can't understand one without the other,
Mm-hmm.
kind of either way.
Right.
And, and that Trump himself would, speak respectfully about Bernie and his following.
Yeah, I just want to point out that, like, one of the reasons why I became interested in the Platypus Affiliated Society, and specifically in you, early on, not that early, but when I was at Zero Books, was precisely because what you were saying about post-neoliberalism matched up with what I was understanding from the 2008 crisis through the Marxist Communist Initiative.
Mm-hmm.
In many ways, and just also because I had been paying attention
Mm-hmm.
to that crisis and listening to a variety of people try to explain what was happening. And there was a sense, I think, around 2008 and 9,
Mm-hmm.
that neoliberals, the neoliberals' days were numbered. That it just would not be able to continue on in the same way after that crisis. And it was shocking to me how long it took.
It's a political process, so that's the other thing. So I was watching this guy Ray Dalio. He's a commentator. I think he's one of these, venture capitalist turned commentator.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what his background is exactly, but he was talking about like the fivefold crisis.
Mm-hmm.
He was talking about like a credit crisis, like a cycle. He was talking about maybe 5 cycles, really, but manifesting as 5 interrelated crises. So it's like a credit crisis, a trade crisis. I'm not going to remember all of them now, but one of them, of course, was a political crisis. And I've always characterized the crisis of neoliberalism as a crisis of its politics. Meaning that's what we see. We see, sure, in the 2008 crisis, we saw the financial crisis. But, so we saw an economic crisis. We saw the Great Recession. But really, how it manifests and why it took some time to really manifest is politically. Meaning, Obama promised a New Deal. He promised a Green New Deal.
Yeah.
And Biden kind of rode on that too. And I think that your experience with the Marxist Humanist Initiative with Andrew Kleinman had to do with the fact that Kleinman thinks of himself as like a Marxist economist and is therefore very anxious to argue against Keynesianism as a rival theory.
Kleinman's odd because he doesn't actually want to say he's a Marxist economist because he's a Marxist and he knows there is no such thing
as a Marxist economist. But he's a professor of economics.
He is, yeah.
He is a professor of economics.
Yeah.
And so what you and Ben Studebaker were getting into, and it really follows on our last discussion 2 weeks ago, ideology. So neoliberalism as a culture, as an economics, as a politics, as an ideology. And that's why, when we had that 3-way conversation with Studebaker, I said, well, look, what is ideology? It's everything. Meaning it's economics, it's politics, it's culture, it's psychology. Because I'd be remiss to ignore the fact that the millennials and also the Zoomers are kind of obsessed with psychology. Meaning the crisis of capitalism can manifest as a psychological crisis. Right? And this is something the Frankfurt School talked about back in the day with the authoritarian personality. It's something that Christopher Lasch talked about with the culture of narcissism. And so, Zizek has been there always alongside the millennial left. And I feel like why he was a teacher for the millennial left is that he did tie it into psychology. Like ideology was psychology for him. And that's the Lacanianism and whatnot. Now, David Harvey is my touchstone on these things. Not because I think David Harvey is great. I think that David Harvey is bad in many respects, especially the way he treats neoliberalism itself, like the brief history of neoliberalism. But when I thought he was being more authentic, more honest, more open, was The Condition of Postmodernity, which was published in 1989, so early days. Right. And I think that he had to really deal with the fact that, as he put it, neoliberalism was not anti-Fordism, it was post-Fordism. So the way that I've written about this is it's not like we have phases of capitalism that negate each other. It's that we have an accumulation. So today, 2025, we are simultaneously living in 19th century first industrial revolution capitalism. We're living in second industrial revolution capitalism. We're living in Fordism. We're living in post-Fordism, neoliberalism. And post-neoliberalism, we have yet to see what it's going to add. But it's definitely going to synthesize that accumulated history differently. So like, everything around us practically, physically, is different things are products of different kind of industrial techniques, to be very like literal about it. But there's just different kinds of production, and this is what gives rise to the fact that people on the left will be like, well, who's really a worker? Do you have to be making things to be part of the proletariat? Can you be a service worker? Right? And so like the ACP, for example, like the American Communist Party, the MAGA communists, have a kind of allergy to the service economy, because they're just like, well, no, you have to be making things. And, obviously this whole thing about manufacturing and re-onshoring manufacturing, and will it bring back the jobs, especially if it's all automated? It'll bring back some jobs, and then those jobs will create other jobs to service those jobs.
Mhm.
There will be people servicing the robots, and there will be people servicing the robots. And I just like to point out that's been true since the original Industrial Revolution, actually.
Right. I wanted to
So
say something about
it's not
why
like,
the
oh, this is going to be the negation of that or something. No.
right. I want to point out why the MAGA communists might want to argue that to be a worker you have to be making things. You might have to be manufacturing or in industry, creating commodities, and it's not simply because they have some sort of economistic view and get confused about what counts as a commodity or something like that.
Right.
But it's also because I think since the 60s and on, there's been this idea that we're in a post class society, that that deindustrialization has created conditions for working class struggle to take a back seat or to not really be actually operative at all, at least in the West.
Right.
And so that led to a lot of new forms of ideology, or somewhat new. And I would put post-structuralism in to that basket of ideologies that was going along with deindustrialization. And we're now facing a crisis of that approach to understanding, but it might appear to be like that's happening because class is returning in the form of manufacturing.
Representative Crockett has followed up on something that I mentioned with you and Studebaker, Hank Johnson, saying that blacks have moved on intellectually beyond agricultural labor. Well, he's followed up by saying, our cotton picking days are over. If they think that they're going to put us back in the fields, they're kidding themselves, right? And so I've also been seeing a lot of footage of Asian women putting circuit boards together in these massive factories. And there is this kind of implausibility that, white Americans are going to be doing that kind of labor.
Have you seen the meme of the AI generated meme of white Americans and Americans in general, like sewing socks and putting together circuit boards?
I have not. No.
Let me see if I can pull it up, but go ahead. I'm not.
Yeah, and I just thought, okay, so then that does bring us around to psychology. And what people used to say when we were growing up, right? Is someone college bound, or rather, are they good with their hands?
Right.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And and I just thought, wow. So I mean, we are kind of there, and I think that J.D. Vance also said something that the Chinese Communist Party had to issue a rebuttal to. He said something like, we don't want to, accept the manufactured products of Chinese peasants anymore. And they were like, wow, isn't that the pot calling the kettle black? Aren't you a hillbilly? And anyway, we're not peasants because look at these wonderful high-speed rail that we have, right? And you know what I mean? But I think that what J.D. Vance was saying is, yeah, you might have technology, but you still have the mentality of a peasant. Right.
And the political
serfdom,
right.
Techno-feudalism, serfdom. Okay, the Chinese are willing to be slave labor because that's what peasant means. But we're not.
Right.
It's very funny.
They don't have the civil liberties and bourgeois values that.
I mean, it's just it's so strange, It's because I just feel like, well, this is like a bourgeois view of the peasants, and it's a kind of bourgeoisification of the peasants, and so what is J.D. Vance? Is he like a lumpen proletariat? Is that what Hillbilly Elegy was? It's lumpen proletariat. It's a lumpen bourgeois. What is it? It's like small town America lumpenized. It is deindustrialization. I mean, it's a strange imagination that we have, and I think that we are. I know that I can be seemingly elusive or beguiling when I talk about these things, that we have to
Mhm.
deal with everything at once. We have to deal with
Mhm.
economics, politics, culture, society, psychology,
Mhm.
all those one package. So to get back to the Harvey point, the regime of accumulation.
Mhm.
There
Well,
might be,
wait, before we do that, I
yeah,
want to show you, you
yeah,
made this
please
point
do.
about our weird imagination.
You want to see the new? We want to see the new. What the AI is going to create is our new regime of accumulation here in the United States.
Yes, that's right.
Why everybody looks so sad? I mean, the Asian women in the factories, footage that I've seen also looked pretty sad. You
Yeah.
know, but they look like, I don't know what, like they're resigned. You know, it's like
Yeah.
the Asiatic.
Yeah, but they
solemnity.
are mostly thinner though. At least they're not these big.
Sure, and younger.
Yeah, right.
Right. So that was the idea. The idea is that you're going to take all these overweight people working these useless office jobs in the government. This is what Scott Bessent got roasted for. You know, like all the people laid off from their government jobs can go work in factories.
Mhm.
And it's like, that's what it looks like. Right.
Yeah,
there.
well, it's the opposite
Yeah.
of the old mantra of learn to code.
Learn to code. Yeah. No, right. So you're not going to learn to code. You're going to go work in a factory.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, politically, the Democrats and therefore the left in their wake are going to try to take advantage of this for the midterm elections and for the 2028 presidential election.
Mhm.
But clearly what Trump is trying to do is set the stage for the next 50 years of history. So, and this is why I've always said we have to take the long view. So we're in a political crisis. We are in a political crisis. And it's a pretty deep political crisis that can get pretty out of control. And there's no force for socialism in that. So we just have to go with however they hash it out, the capitalists. I pointed out at my panel, look, it will mean sacrificing some capitalists.
Mm.
The state does that. It can do that. It makes those decisions. I mean, really what people were upset about, like Luigi Mangione killing the CEO of United Healthcare. What the millennials were upset about was that Obama couldn't sacrifice the health insurance industry.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, I think that we can all agree Trump obviously doesn't care about anybody. He really doesn't. In other words, he got elected. As far as he's concerned, therefore, all of his supporters, everyone who put him in office, is on the chopping block. They are, because he doesn't need them anymore. He can't run again. It's over. And he doesn't care about the Republicans keeping a congressional majority. He's fighting against the Republicans as much as against the Democrats. He does not care. He does not care. And so he's in a unique position to do something that no other politician can do. And he's also the power of the presidency to do it.
You would call him Bonapartist, right?
Sure. I mean, he is. I mean, we've been talking about Bonapartism in a couple of different respects. The state is Bonapartist, meaning it just does things. But then, like, I guess in a more conventional sense, not in a Marxist sense, but in a more conventional sense, like in a liberal sense, something bad that we're supposed to avoid, Bonapartism, rather than something endemic and chronic. That's just the nature of the capitalist state, that it does pick winners and losers. You know how the neoliberal thing was? Well, the state shouldn't. It's Milton Friedman, right? The state shouldn't pick winners and losers. The state has to pick winners and losers. It does so all the time. And it does so bureaucratically. It does so politically. For politicians, it's hard, though. For politicians, it's hard to say, we're doing this.
Mm-hmm.
We're picking winners and losers. Too bad. It's very hard for them to do that.
But not for Trump right now.
No, not for Trump right now. And, I think he wanted to do it in the first term, and he wanted to see it through in the second term. But he really didn't have the opportunity in the first term. And I always write about this. I think he welcomed the congressional Democratic majority in 2018 as something to use against the Republicans, because
he underestimated the opposition he would be receiving.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way he put it when they were sworn in, he said, hopefully it's an opportunity for negotiations, not investigations. So he saw the, impeachments coming because they had promised to impeach him if they got the majority, right? And then they thought, oh, well, since we got the majority, the voters must want us to impeach him, and then they impeached him. They could have impeached him on anything, I guess, but Ukraine, right? In other words, the one thing that probably was the least popular reason to impeach him.
Right.
And yet also felt most urgent for them to impeach him, right? But that seems to be over, meaning obviously Biden, tried to see through all that stuff to the conclusion. He did the Ukraine as much as he possibly could, and obviously it's just a big debacle. So there is a passive bipartisan consensus now to support what Trump is doing on that front, at least. And on the tariff front, it's a little bit different, right? It's on the tariff front, it's a little bit different because I feel like I was just watching this morning his the Trump administration trade representative, Jameson Greer, testifying in the Senate. I might have mistaken his last name. But and the Democrats are saying, well, Trump has diagnosed the problem, but his solution sucks. And then they're like, well, tariffs are good, but shouldn't he have been more strategic about them?
Right.
Right. And and the trade.
And let me just point out, he's put tariffs on places that are only populated by penguins.
Sure, because they can be used legalistically as cutouts. They can.
Well, okay.
No,
okay.
That's the reason. That's the reason. Like there were no mistakes made. Like I've heard people say that he mistakenly put twice the tariff he intended to. I've heard people say he mistakenly put half the tariff he intended to. So all this language of he doesn't know what he's doing and they're making mistakes, and that's just a lie. That's just simply a lie.
Okay, because I really did buy it. Like,
of course you did. Because they say it with a straight face. When someone lies to you with a straight face, your first impulse is to believe them. Right. But we should know after 10 years, of course,
right.
It's a lie.
Yeah, but I mean, I didn't get this information from someone who I immediately read as a Democratic Party operative, but like, it was just some YouTubers, like some
and conventional Republicans too. I mean, look, everybody is against this, and that's why he's got to do it.
Right.
And so, there was an Atlantic article that I was reading that was like, oh, these masterminds of the tariff policy, like Steve Miron and Scott Bessent, and are just rationalizers for Trump's impulses. Right. And so Trump is not implementing their policy. What he's doing is using their policy proposal as like a screen for just doing what he wants to do on impulse. And and there was all this talk, like Scott Bessent is one of the main spokespeople for the administration on the tariffs, but then there was all this talk that he's looking to leave the administration because they didn't implement them the way he wanted to. And then there's tension between him and Howard Lutnick, right, who's an old friend of Trump's, whereas Scott Bessent is a more recent joiner of the Trump team. And obviously Steve Miron, like his white paper, from last year, I just feel like actually Trump is doing what we would expect a president to do, which is that he's got a general policy orientation. He's got certain intentions. He's got certain things he wants to accomplish. And then he assembled a team to do it. And then they're going to work out the details. But also maybe there are going to be simultaneously different ways of doing it that he can tack between.
Right. Well, right? I had a conversation with Jeff Schellenberger and on Twitter, and he raised the fact that Trump is claiming he wants to run absolutely no trade deficits with any country.
Right. Well, that's an absurdity.
Right.
However, it's a great bargaining position.
Yeah, that's what I told him.
Especially if it's Nixon madman theory, meaning like he is president. That's it. So even if he's crazy, they got to deal with him. But he's not.
Right.
But he's not. Right. That's the other thing. He's not. And he is taking people's advice, or he's taking what they say under advisement.
Right.
right? And so again, foreign policy team, with the signal chat brouhaha, right? Where it's like, oh, look, there were these differences in the Trump administration. Oh, Mike Waltz, was he the leaker? Because he's like the neocon versus JD Vance. No. It serves Trump to have opposite perspectives in the same administration, because then he can tack between them. And he can ultimately get what he wants. And he's been saying what he wants for 40 years. So it's not like we don't know. And he is out to remake the global and the American economic order and political order, obviously. Right.
So-
Again, it's a package deal. It's the whole thing.
So I often will talk about how when we think about Trump, we should think about the opportunities that might be arising. For instance, if manufacturing does really return, that will mean that the ideology of a classless society might actually be damaged.
I think that's gone anyway. I think people know that there is class. It's how they characterize it that's at issue.
Okay.
Educated versus uneducated.
Right.
I mean, in other words, we have our dogmas.
We
got to be very careful about our dogmas. Right.
Say more.
We're gonna be here to say, oh no, that's not what class means. It kind of doesn't matter. Meaning, we could say, oh well, the Marxist view on class is very technical. It's about Das Kapital. We have to deal with the colloquial meaning. We have to deal with the mainstream political ideology. We have to deal with the way things appear to people. We have to deal with how things appear plausible to people. And generally, I mentioned this on the panel, the left is very averse to doing that, because to deal with the actual consciousness of actual workers, as Adorno put it, is kind of mortifying. Because the actual consciousness of actual workers, as Adorno put it, is as mutilated as the bourgeois type. I mean, in other words, I think that I said in my talk, the freedom of the capitalists is disgusting. The freedom of the workers is scary.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. Let's get into your presentation. We've been talking around it for a little while. You claimed, this is where I want to start, and I think
can I say something, just the last thing about the Trump bit with the tariffs?
There's
the man in the moment, meaning, and again, how we understand history, that Trump is, the way that I put it in my talk, the last 20th century politician that we're going to have. Except maybe, I don't know, if Marco Rubio is president next instead of JD Vance or something, right? But probably, so it's formulated in the 1980s. His perspective. And so he's a sort of figure outside of time. I wrote an article on this, the Sandinistas, about how Bernie and Trump and Jeremy Corbyn were all 80s people whose time had come now. So there's the man in the moment. And the fact that the man in the moment are historically disjointed is part of the point. Meaning, when you remember when Obama said those jobs aren't coming back?
Yeah, and Hillary Clinton said it too.
Right. You're not going to hear the Democrats banging that drum anymore, I don't think.
No.
They might say it to a certain degree, but they're just not going to, they know that just is not a good talking point, if you will. So the fact that he wants to apparently turn the clock back, and yet, of course, he can't. Meaning, if he brings back factories, they're going to be the latest automated factories. They're not going to be the factories of even the 80s and 90s, which were already quite automated. And he's not going to break down international trade. That's the other thing. He's not an isolationist or a protectionist. He's not an anti-globalist, if we were to use that term. He thinks that the global economy can be managed better, more advantageously for the United States, but also less wastefully for the entire world, meaning to the benefit of the US better, but also to the benefit of other countries as well. I think that Scott Bessent, he might have been the one who said that Trump is putting people into 3 baskets, the countries, right? Allies, neutral, and enemies. Right? And that part of the negotiation of the tariffs is going to have to do with that. Meaning, it's going to be up to those countries which basket they join. Right? In other words, is Europe going to be a neutral or going to be an ally?
Right.
Right? But also, maybe China is going to be an ally and Europe's going to be neutral. So, again, I think that there was the man and there was the moment. He was just saying, I think when he had his press conference with Netanyahu, or press gaggle, not a press conference, he said, oh, well, yeah, back then it was Japan, now it's China. It's the same problem.
Yeah.
Right?
It's different in degree. China is more of a competitor than Japan ever.
At that time, though, I don't know if you remember, in the 80s,
I do remember.
People really thought Japan was going to take over.
Do you remember the movie Gung Ho with Michael Keaton?
Sure.
Yeah, right.
Lost in translation. There was a song speaking Japanese.
I'm turning Japanese.
Oh, I'm turning Japanese. That's right. And so, anime has made it into Star Wars, for Christ's sake.
No, I know. Japan became a major cultural force globally, for sure.
Yeah. But again, to his mind, it's like Japan is an enemy, Japan is a friend, China is an enemy, China is a friend. This is the thing that has everyone so annoyed, is that it's like, well, it's predictability. And it's like, but what if we're really reordering the global system?
Right.
Now, it's something that you and Studebaker got into, is the end of history, and whether we're still in the end of history or whether there's the return of history. If the return of history means multipolarity and unipolarity means the end of history. I want to say something about that. The 19th century, like he said the 19th century was one in which there was great ideological conflict, but it wasn't associated with nation states. Yes and no. Meaning, 19th century was Pax Britannica. Meaning from 1814 to 1914, it was Pax Britannica. Meaning Napoleon was defeated by the British, and then that system that was set up was torn apart by the Germans, and then the Americans came in and took it over from the British. And we've had Pax Americana now in the wake. And I was reading something, Stephen Moran. So he was saying, he's the white paper author. He was saying that, the era of U.S. rule, global hegemony, has been the most peaceful in all of human history. Well, that's kind of a stretch. Korea, Vietnam, war and terror, and all the proxy wars of the Cold War, all the civil wars in Africa, all the Latin American insurgencies, counterinsurgencies. Like, really? This is the most peaceful era? But what he meant was no war between the major capitalist states.
Yeah, he's talking about scale, right?
But even scale, I mean, millions and millions of people. I mean, the 20th century is bloody.
Yeah. Usually when I think about the 20th century being bloody, I think about World War I, World War II.
No, Vietnam, I mean.
And Vietnam, yeah.
Korea too. Korea.
Yeah. But how many? But I think it's like 10 times less or something.
It might be. I mean, obviously World War II is pretty out of hand. To say the least, right? It's tens of millions in Asia and tens of millions in Europe. So it is. No, I get it. But I think that what's meant is peace among the major states. And, are we going to see an end to that? Because I do think that the anticipation that this trade war is going to lead to World War III, we have to resist that.
Well, look, the lack of a trade war was leading to World War III.
Right.
That's
the other thing, is that in some ways, Trump is getting out ahead of a crisis, meaning he's triggering a crisis that was bound to come. And, the last thing that I'll say about that is, obviously Bretton Woods came out of World War II. So the U.S. didn't unilaterally change the world in that way, except of course it did, but it did so by winning World War II, meaning World War II is something that the U.S. was hoping to avoid. Nixon, when he ended the Bretton Woods system in 1971, that was huge. And even what Reagan did with the Plaza Accords in 1984 was big. And so Trump is trying to do something along the same lines. And in all those cases, obviously Bretton Woods is a unique situation, but really, even then, the world agreed to shore up the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is whether Trump can force the world to shore up the US yet again. And the idea here that Miran and Besant and others have is there's a narrow window of opportunity for the US to be able to do that.
Right. Well, and I have to wonder, is Trump the right man for the job?
Who would be better?
Maybe someone like Vance. I mean,
you mean more bellicose, more anti?
Not exactly. But it's just that Trump comes across to the Europeans, I think, is like a too much of a showman, not serious enough, not polished. Vance is a little more polished, regardless.
The stylistic disconnect is important, though, meaning the fact that Vance is a more traditional politician than Trump, actually.
Right.
The fact that Trump is not a traditional politician gives him leverage.
Yeah, but it doesn't calm the nerves of the...
Oh, no, but he's not trying to calm anybody's nerves. In other words, like, he is actually trying to terrorize into submission. He is. Definitely.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Yeah. No, he's not trying to do that.
So just on that for a moment, like, when it comes to Canada, if he had played his cards differently, he might have...
joining the Union?
Well, possibly. I mean, not exactly, but possibly. You know, like he would have had a conservative to
Premier.
work with. Yeah,
he might still.
Well,
when's the election?
Oh, good question.
2 months still.
Yeah, but it looks like.
Meaning, if Trump outfoxes this guy, the liberal guy now, then the conservatives can still come in. And anyway, he might want a liberal instead of a conservative, meaning he might want an opponent rather than an ally. Might be easier for him to deal with opponents rather than allies, you know. Because the other thing is, you know, like, these countries have to put up a fight. They have to, like, at least appear to put up a fight.
Right. Well, not if the will of the Canadian public is behind an ally of Trump's who can sell the changes and the shoring up of America to the public.
Right. But if you're trying to drive a hard bargain, you might not want to come to a compromise too soon.
Okay.
No, the U.S. is playing for maximum advantage.
No, I know. But look, okay, but all of this
really translates into this. It really translates into this. The rest of the world is going to have to accept being poorer in order to allow the U.S. to be richer. That's a hard one.
But it looks like right now that with the tariffs, that the U.S. will also have to accept being poorer.
You mean like this year, or something? Or no? Yeah. I mean, obviously they cut down some inflated. That was the other thing that is interesting in the mix, is that the stock market was probably overinflated anyway. And so, again, triggering the crash, having a controlled crash, having a crash under conditions of one's own choosing. Right, there's asset inflation, you know, and broadly speaking, but stock market inflation. What was it that Besant said? He said it's a Mag 7, not a MAGA crisis, meaning its tech was overinflated, right, overvalued. And so it just had to come down. And yet, obviously, it can't be wiped out because that's also one of the few areas that the U.S. is competitive.
Right. But here's my problem, I think. I don't disagree with your arguments. Like, I find them all plausible. But ultimately, I feel as though I'm better off if I just say, look, I'm not here to advise any capitalist administration.
Right.
And I don't know whether or not Trump's strategies are going to work.
Right.
And if I did start to think about how I would do it differently, probably.
Yeah.
Right. But I'm not in that position. So, and that's not my task, and that's not what I want to do.
Right.
So the question becomes, for me, like, how invested should I be in this notion that we're going to be able to build up the manufacturing base and therefore really break through the neoliberal, post-structural, so-called left ideology to be able to organize more effectively amongst working class people. And how important is it that on some level Trump succeeds for my socialist project, and I don't want it to be that important, right?
Yeah, I mean, we have to deal with whatever. We have to deal with whether, and also succeeding. It's going to be a combination of success and failure. Meaning, all that we can say is that the capitalist politicians, in this case Trump, are going to try to affect things. It's not going to work out just as they intend, but we have to deal with whatever results.
Right, like voodoo economics under Reagan created massive deficits, even though he said they wouldn't.
Yes.
Right, but it worked out well enough for it to continue for quite a long time that way.
Yeah, and it actually changed conditions on the ground. I mean, I think that people want to know, like, should we be happy or sad about the changes? And it's like, well, since we have no control over them, we kind of can't be either happy or sad.
Right. Well, we should be sad that we have no control over them.
We should be sad that we have no control over them. But then we're into this other stuff, and maybe that's where we can segue to the panel discussion.
So you said, this is where I want to start. You said that Democrats have long been called the graveyard of the left, more specifically the graveyard of movements, but that means it's where they go after they die, it's not what killed them. They committed suicide as leftist movements, and this is how they ended up in the Democratic Party, actually giving it a new life. How did they kill themselves politically? By abandoning their ambition. Why did they do so? Because they could see no way forward. This is where we are now, a sense of profound impasse. And then I think it's after this that you say the bourgeoisie are disgusting and are awful, and the workers
capitalists are disgusting and the workers are scary.
Yeah, right. And you could reverse that. It's also true, but
yeah.
But
I think that people mostly identify with the capitalists. In other words, I think that the left is like sincerely alienated from the working class. Meaning they're just like, okay, how do these people work 3 jobs? And, like they just are like, can't relate really. Whereas they can relate to the capitalist class, and they're just like, yeah, but I
can relate. I just would hate to have to work 3 jobs. Like I
totally, you know what I mean? Like how do people actually do it? And meaning like, again, we've talked about this, about how the downwardly mobile aspect of the millennials was such that they were like, oh fuck, this must be what it means to be a proletarian. Because it's so fucked up, and I had no idea like that work was so hard. And yet obviously there are tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people who day in day out work, and whereas the millennials, like, they're a month on the job and they're like, we need communism.
I'm gonna I'm gonna confess something to you about my work life. I worked for overall 20 years for the Oregon Symphony in the ticket office, doing telemarketing work and also taking orders as they came in, and at the hall. And but in between, there was about a 2-year period where I didn't work there. I worked at Comcast in a big call center, and I hated it. I hated it. It was the worst. And I was no longer surrounded by downward, like D class A, college educated people. I was surrounded by actually working class people, a variety of types, and I realized that I was somehow different than they were. That they in some ways were better people than I was.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah,
they are,
because they're had a better
solid people.
They had a better work ethic. They had their heads on straight. They weren't off in space or thinking about revolution or writing science fiction novels or dreaming about becoming a star in some way.
Discontented.
They were discontented, but they didn't.
Not like you.
Yeah, right.
Not like you. Right.
So it was a good learning experience, and I made friends.
Of course. Yeah. No, I've had proletarian jobs, and I made friends because they do make friends.
Yeah. Right. No, they
downwardly mobile PMC don't make friends. They make frenemies.
I didn't go out of my way to make friends with anyone.
No,
They
no.
made friends with me.
They're
right?
friendly. Yeah.
Right.
Working classes,
Yeah.
these are real
Yeah.
people, as I
Yeah.
like to put it. Real people.
Yeah.
Doesn't
So
mean
I
that they're
just,
not fucked up, but it does mean that it's different.
yeah.
Like, they have a quiet misery. They do.
Not always quiet.
Right.
The girl who would give me a ride back to downtown Portland or back to my neighborhood because she lived, it was carpooling, and I would talk to her about her life, and she was like, "Oh yeah, last night I had to beat this bitch up. She was looking at my boyfriend." So,
That's not misery. That's agency.
yeah, okay,
That's
true.
agency.
Yeah, that's true.
That's civil
Yeah.
social life.
Yeah.
No, I mean, early on in Platypus, there was a fight within the Change to Win coalition before they got reabsorbed into the AFL-CIO. And there was some faction or other was taking over a local, and people were locking themselves in their office, hiding under their desks. People were beating each other up at the union office, right? And I just said to the Platypus kids, because they were kind of horrified by it, they had some personal connections to it, and I was just like, yeah, you understand that a reinvigorated workers movement means brass knuckles, literally, right? It means broken bones, it means busted up faces. That's what it means. The left is not ready for that.
I wouldn't want to have my face busted up. I'm an old man. I'd have a stroke. I don't need that shit.
Of course. No, absolutely. But we're intellectuals. There is a difference between being an intellectual and being a worker. There is. We have to give up this kind of I don't know what, bourgeois, but we're part of the people. No. Intellectuals, no. We have a role to play. And you know what? Back in the day, the workers were willing to put their bodies on the line so that the intellectuals didn't have to. Really? Because they were like, yeah, we need those brain bugs. Do you remember the brain bugs, Starship Troopers? We have to protect the brain bugs. We need them.
Right. Well, that's the other thing, that the pressure then to actually be smart,
So this is what I've been doing with my life. In other words, I've actually disciplined myself. I've tried to create something that's going to be useful to a socialist movement someday. Rather than telling myself a story, which I know everybody is like, oh, Chris Cutrone, it's myth making, and it's sophistry, and it's like, no, this is after a long education and training, this is what I have to say, meaning, no, right? This is why we have to be careful about the Trump phenomenon. I think that I said at the members meeting at the convention, so you weren't there. I said, look, I know that the Platypus kids, you just want Trump to be over. You want it to go away. You want it to have never happened. I know that. But this is probably the major political event of your lifetime. So you have to learn from this.
Right.
I think Ray Dalio was saying something like every 50 years. So we're about due, right? Reagan Thatcher revolution and now, right? So even though Trump, has been at the gates for 10 years, he's only really entered into the thick of it now. Second term Trump is really his first term. It is like what you were saying, voodoo economics. It's first term Reagan and Thatcher, which was a fiasco. Nonetheless, it completely changed things. And so that's what we have to deal with. And I think that the left just thinks about workers as people to support a policy. It's like the panel that I was on, with Bronco, and I think Alex Higgins too. They have this idea, Andrew Hartman less so, because he's just an academic historian. So he doesn't.
I liked him best of the three that weren't you.
Because he's our generation, of course. Of course we like him best, right?
Oh, okay.
He's good friends with Touré Reed, down at Illinois State University.
Well, I didn't think that was it. I thought it was because he was the most sensible,
thoughtful
one. Yeah.
Well, he was doing less bullshitting. That's true. That's true. But the other two, okay, so why were the other two, Alex Higgins and Bronco, why were they bullshitting? Because they're still thinking, oh, how do we appeal to the working class? And it's like, that's not the way it's going to happen. It's not like we're going to find some way. Because what that is, I think the way I put it, which article is this? That, maybe it's the end of millennial Marxism, I think. Where, and also, I think you were there for the panel discussion that I was on with Donald Parkinson from Cosmonaut and with Ben Studebaker and with James.
No,
Harper.
I wasn't. I arrived after. I arrived at 8:00 that night.
No.
Well,
3 years ago.
Oh,
You
yeah.
remember.
So yeah, I was.
Up at
Yeah,
Northwestern, you were there.
Yeah,
And,
I was there. Yeah.
where I said, look, the DSA, what are they doing? They're just trying to find like a messaging for the Democrats. Like Medicare for all is just like a message, really. I mean, it's a policy, and so they invested with all the stuff, but at the end of the day, for the Democrats, it's a message. So it's messaging, and so the
clearly
idea,
now, because they never intend to deliver on the policy, or
right.
So right, it's a message,
Right.
and it works very well as something they don't deliver, so they can continue to make it as a message.
But also, who did it actually appeal to? Meaning, obviously, it didn't get a broad, overwhelming working class support.
No.
Right? In other words, it was messaging for the youth vote that was disaffected with Obama to get them to show up at the polls.
Right.
Right. That's what Bernie had to offer with Medicare for All. He had a message to reach the youth vote to help restore the Obama coalition to elect Hillary. Right? And so that's all that it ever was. Right? And so, again, the left is like, well, how do we talk to the working class? How do we appeal to the working class? What will the working class support at the level of policy? And it's like, that is not how we're going to rebuild a socialist movement. No. I mean, this is why we're just, very much disconnected from whatever they imagine, that it's like incremental, that first you elect the Democrats, then you make them more progressive, then
you make them more progressive. I mean, why would you want to do that? I mean, from my perspective, because the progressives to me are simply the Wilsonian
obstacle, right? No, people don't like that though, Doug, because again, the idea is that if you force the Democrats to rely on a voting base that requires public goods, then that's your basis for socialism. It's very 60s. It's very retread of the 60s, right? That was the idea that people had in the 60s.
But workers don't want to rely on public goods, and for good reason.
Okay, so that brings up back the issue of neoliberalism, by the way.
Right.
Which is, what are you talking about? They rely on public goods all the time. And, and if they don't like it, that's just neoliberal ideology. That's just like, everyone thinks that they're going to be rich, or everyone, the Democrats literally say this. They say, Donald Trump is a poor person's idea of a rich person. And that's his appeal. Right. So basically, they scorn the working class appeal that Trump has by saying, it's because they want to be like him. It's like, no, they know that they're not going to be like him.
Right.
They know they're not going to be rich like that.
Yeah.
But they do feel like he's not bullshitting them.
Right. And also, they want to be friends with people like him because people like him will employ them. I mean, on a smaller scale.
Too. Sure. Well, right. I mean, there's that too. I mean, but the thing is, maybe be friends. I mean,
or at least support. Like,
you can kind of understand him. In other words, they could be like, I hate my boss, but I understand him. Whereas I have no idea what Kamala Harris is, what species this is.
Right. I have no trouble understanding what species Kamala Harris is, by the way.
I know we don't. Right. But again, that's the way that we're not working class.
Right.
Meaning, we know that Kamala Harris could be the provost of whatever at whatever university, or she
run the Oregon Symphony. She could be the
absolutely. She could absolutely run a symphony, or she could be a psychotherapist or whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
We know that type. Yeah, right. And so with us, familiarity breeds contempt.
Right.
You know, and so I mean, again, what we have to do. Well, first of all, what we have to do is disabuse ourselves of all sorts of leftist delusions. I mean, that's what we've been trying to do because the Platypus Convention brings this to mind, the negative character of it, the dissolving of ideological obstacles in an acid bath.
Right.
And, I mean, in that respect.
I thought my panel, I did that more than you did. Maybe.
Sure, you did.
Yeah.
Of course.
I was really attempting to dissolve.
You did. You mean, like, you had warned me that you were going to go after Bill Ayers.
Right. Yeah.
And I wasn't sure how I felt about that because he's, like, slippery. But then he wasn't. He proudly stood his ground, right? Like, he kind of tried to be like, no. But then he's like, actually, yes.
Right.
And it was amazing because Platypus has had him on panels before, and he's usually been more slippery, and he's usually more contrite about his Weather Underground days. But now he was like, yes, Luigi Mangione, yes. He's like, my first impulse was to tell people, don't be Luigi Mangione, but when I saw how popular he was, then I changed my mind and said yes. And I thought, this is perfect.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
That's really perfect.
Someone else came up to me and said that the moment for them where he really exposed himself was when we were asked, is politics always going to be a part of the human experience? And I said no, and he said absolutely yes. And as did, I think, the other two.
Alex Higgins, yes. Right. Yeah. Alex Higgins for sure, because he's a neo-Republican, small r Republican. So he doesn't like the idea of the withering away of the state as the overcoming the need for democracy, like that. And maybe Dave McCarricker, I don't know. He also would like to be free of politics, but that's a way that Dave is kind of very 60s.
Right.
In his own way. Although he was, in a way, you guys were tag teaming Bill Ayers, because he also had his criticism of Bill Ayers as well. I think that he and his crew, I think that they read the Weather Underground Manifesto ahead of
the Prairie Fire.
Yeah.
I read some of it. I did too, but ahead of it. Yeah.
Because I saw some picture on Facebook where they were like all like convening to talk about, and I was like, okay. Right. So, I mean, in that respect, I thought, Bill Ayers, and he was definitely disavowing Obama in a profound way.
He was.
Even though he did launch Obama.
He did.
Yeah, in his
room.
Living room.
In his living room. And I mean, was he the most important person? No. But did he absolutely give him his first big event? Apparently, and certainly he didn't disavow Obama then, right? He didn't say, he was clearly like, whether or not he wants to call himself a Democrat, he was trying to help the Democratic Party pick their president as an insider.
No, I mean, he is obviously a Democrat, meaning, I mean, this is the thing that got us in trouble when we were talking about October 7th. Terrorism is capitalist politics. Like, it really does help. Meaning, like, Luigi Mangione killing the United Healthcare CEO guy, the only possible effect it could have, and it could have that effect, was in capitalist politics.
Yeah, to undermine Trump and Elon Musk and help shore up voters, the young vote again in the midterms.
Yep. So it's kind of like, and again, to put healthcare as an issue back on the agenda, all sorts of people talked about it in Congress, so, it's kind of like the Hamas attack put Israel-Palestine back in the public discourse in a way that it hadn't been for a while. Right? And so, and the best that could come of it is some kind of negotiation among the capitalist politicians.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, of course, it didn't even.
Not yet.
Yeah, it
Not
didn't
yet.
even.
Well, yeah.
I mean, we'll see. But
But not without a whole lot of bloodshed. Not without a whole
oh
lot
well,
of bloodshed.
surely you mean Hamas? Yes. I mean, with Luigi Mangione, obviously it's really helpless. Meaning, like, obviously that's not gonna put the wind in the sails of any kind of healthcare reform.
Oh no, no.
Right.
But it will keep the left glued to the Democrats. That's one of the things it does.
It will.
Yeah.
That's right.
So I don't know if I convinced anyone in that room who wasn't already convinced not to follow the Luigi Mangione path back to the Democrats, but that was my intent in going after Bill Ayers, was to.
I mean, we've produced these things for posterity now. The panels on YouTube, and maybe it will be transcribed, and so it's there, to have an impact and to be recalled. I think that if Trump blasts through the way he seems to be, suddenly all of this stuff from recent years and certainly from 50 years ago is going to appear ancient history. Right. And I think that that's one thing that we could welcome, is that it's creating a situation that we can't just apply our old frameworks for understanding on.
Right.
And that could force people to think, maybe. I don't know. I mean, that's why I brought up David Harvey, because I thought, okay, there was a moment, like in the late 80s, where people were trying to honestly reckon with neoliberalism. And then they just sort of turned it into, oh, well, the rich people are always acting in their interests, and they're just always trying to screw over the working class. And, it's like, so nothing about changes in regimes of accumulation, nothing about changes in people's lifestyles and work patterns, like none of that, just gone. Just like, oh, yeah, the rich people always, pursue their interests and shaft the poor people.
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting moment, because I saw someone had written up how much it would cost to make an iPhone if all the parts were made in America, and what the cost of an iPhone would be then. It was something like $2,000 to $3,000 per iPhone, which would, of course, restrict how many people had iPhones, and it would also, I think, translate to other kinds of phones like Androids and what have you, would also be more expensive, which would mean that the role of the internet would change.
Oh, you think poor people wouldn't have smartphones anymore?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. If they were to have smartphones still, then there would have to be some innovation to cheapen the production of those.
Well, as we know, Elon Musk's plan is to put a chip in our heads, and I think that's ultimately where it's going, and that will be pretty cheap.
Oh, wow. Jesus Christ.
No, seriously. That is where it's going.
Yeah, but you're my age. You understand.
Oh, yeah.
You understand.
Yeah, I'm just like, okay, hopefully I'll be dead by then. But I don't know, I don't know. My aging hands, I don't know. Maybe I prefer a chip in my head to having to hold this device and try to write emails on it. I mean, really.
That was even 10 years ago. That to say, oh, we're going to end up with chips in our head was like the crazy paranoid talk of the science fiction author.
Right. Well, the chip in your head is going to fix all your medical problems as well as jack you into the internet.
Right. It will make us live forever.
It's not going to make us live forever, but it's going to monitor our, I don't know, A1C levels or whatever. It's going to.
No, you don't know about Aubrey de Grey. He's also going to be using AI and all this data we'll get from the chips in our heads to perfect his plan for.
Oh, yes. That will be well, of course, we'll be, as we are now, the guinea pigs.
Right.
Right. In other words, it will be a massive data collection operation, which may or may not benefit the guinea pigs, but will produce some kind of new technology. Medical right. But, but in any case, I mean, look, Scott Bessent has said moving from a consumer-oriented to a producer-oriented economy.
Right. Huge. That is a huge change for people who grew up as we did in the consumer
Yeah,
society.
and he said, what did he say? He said, "Let them eat flat screens" is no longer going to be the motto.
Right. Does that mean that we're going to no longer have
No, we'll have flat
television
screens,
Okay.
right? They're cheap, but our economy won't be based on only getting workers enough to buy cheap flat screens.
Well, they won't be so cheap. Is the other
Maybe
part
they
of it.
won't be so cheap, or maybe they will still be cheap. I mean, the thing is, again, rather than thinking that this is going to be some
No, you don't. You won't need them. They'll just directly into
That's
the
the other
chip.
thing. That's why I said the chip in your head. Right, we won't need these devices because it will just be you get to be a certain age, and then you get the chip implanted, and then rich people will get really good chips implanted, and poor people will get really shitty chips implanted.
Mm-hmm. That sounds okay.
Yeah. Right? It'll be like getting braces. You know how everybody gets braces
Mm-hmm.
and it costs a few $1,000s or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it will be like that will be, the chip implant.
Oh, if they do it like that, they won't even have to tell us they're putting the chip in. They'll just put the braces in and like install the chip.
Right.
Yeah, no, okay. So the future, I had a thought a while ago, and it occurred to me again that often enough the dystopian visions that we have are actually our secret hopes.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Right.
They're what we desire. We desire and fear these things. And
Yeah.
also, something that seems very futuristic is actually right now.
Right.
It's coming really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my sense of it is, again, from my perspective, and this is where I'm a political thinker.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm not thinking about like marketing the next commodity, right? I'm not thinking, okay, what's the psychology and sensibility of the future going to be that I need to, make an anime like this instead of like that or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking just politically. So when I'm thinking of it that way, then I am thinking about what are the possibilities, like meaning in some respects, maybe the left-right divide from the 20th century won't obtain anymore. So that's that post-leftism that we've had in the environment for a good amount of time now. To my mind, that's why I always insist on defining left as socialist, which doesn't answer the question, but kind of opens the question in another way. But at least disconnecting it, disaggregating it from progressivism. And there's also the question of who's progressive now. Is Trump the progressive? Right? In other words, is he the one who's, going for capitalist progress and trying to find a more viable form of capitalism through reforming it? And whether that's good or bad for the workers, it's more viable, right? Meaning, okay, so more people have jobs, but they'll be shitty jobs or something, right? So again, what Thatcher and Reagan and Newt Gingrich said, that they were the real progressives. And that they were fighting against the conservatives in the Democratic and Labor parties and in their own parties. Right? And so that's where we have to pay attention to the fact that, FDR was a progressive, but he was also a conservative. And, Reagan and Thatcher were conservative, but they were also progressive.
Right. But when I hear progressive, I think about statification.
Well, maybe that's the other thing, though, that we should be careful of. So, again, I think that I mentioned this in one of my articles. I think it may be about Postone, but maybe in another article, I mentioned Moish saying that perhaps capitalism will oscillate like a pendulum swing between market-oriented versus state-oriented forms. And that's, I feel like it's actually important to note that neoliberalism was not less statist than Fordism, and in many respects, it's more statist, meaning there was more civil society under Fordism than there is under neoliberalism.
Right, I know. And so when you say that Trump is progressive, I would see that as him being post-neoliberal in so much as that might also include hyper-neoliberal.
Yeah,
and I worry about that because
statification,
because of the statification, and particularly, the expansion of surveillance police state of control, which has amped up in my adult lifetime dramatically.
I mean, really, the role of the state at a concrete level has to change with the form of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
Which doesn't mean more or less. It just means operating differently. And it might just be the case that the state inevitably takes a stronger and stronger role. I mean, the other thing that people were talking about just a few years ago now, but I wonder the new situation produced by the tariffs and what will result from them. You know, people would say, well, the only possible politics is at the nation state level. Like, there isn't really international politics.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there is, right? So even though politics might, in some respects, seem to be a primarily nation state delimited phenomenon,
Mm-hmm.
clearly, and this is where, again, Trump as president, he can do a lot more foreign policy wise than he can do domestic policy wise.
Mm-hmm.
And so how is he using foreign policy to affect domestic policy? Like, he's creating a situation that forces changes in domestic policy that he doesn't have the ability to act unilaterally on.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And yet he's going to need international partners to do that.
Right.
So if he's the global hegemon, and similarly, if the degree to which the Democrats are going to put up a resistance, they're going to need other foreign state actors to help them.
Right.
Right? To fight against Trump's allies in the other countries.
Right, which is one of the things that I recognized during the whole Twitter files thing, which was that it was wrong to think of it as a U.S. policy, a U.S.-based effort. It was a global effort, certainly between the Five Eyes or NATO and the United States.
The European Union.
Yeah.
European Union. And of course, people made a big deal about this, at least on Fox News. That the problem with Silicon Valley is that they accepted a lot of Chinese rules.
Mm-hmm.
And that also affected the way they did things here.
Right.
Right. That accepting the Chinese rules was a kind of a laboratory for how they were able to establish a censorship regime here.
Right. China, apparently, a rumor is that China is going to ban Western movies in China. And Walter
it goes more than that. It goes more than that. You know, they're talking about how maybe the internet's going to be divided up, that it won't be a World Wide Web anymore.
Well,
that
it's not in China.
Internet, it is a China internet and an India internet and an American internet or something.
Well, I mean, in China, it's already a Chinese internet for the most part. But
I think people probably still can get it though. Like, I have an Iranian student who is a TA of mine.
Mm-hmm.
He's one of my two fresh off the boat TAs. I have a Nigerian and an Iranian, and then I have Omer as my third TA.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Oh yeah, of course the Western internet is banned in Iran, but everybody gets it anyway."
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know if that would.
Meaning you can be arrested for it, but everybody does it.
Right,
Meaning that it's just an arbitrary state thing. You know, whether you're arrested for it.
Yeah, know? I don't know if you try to divide up the internet, if you're really going to ever get around, people can get it anyway. Maybe
it's the apps. It's the apps. In other words, if other countries don't use U.S. apps,
well, which again, in China they don't to a large extent.
Right.
So, but the
it's Web 2.0. Everything's through an app. So I'm still against it.
But yeah,
I'm for www.
Yeah, me too. Right? I like the HTTPS /
or just HTTP, not even S. Does it have to be secure? Right. It can be a web page.
Okay.
You know?
All right. I didn't even notice the introduction of the S.
Yeah, Web 1.0. I like Web 1.0. Web 2.0 sucks because it's all apps.
Yeah. But the point to go back to the Hollywood movies is that the immediate response from Walter Kern was great. Maybe we can get movies that are about real people or life that is recognizable.
Oh no, so he thinks that American movies suck because they're made for a Chinese audience.
Yeah, and I don't think he's wrong.
I don't know. Maybe.
I think it's not that the Chinese people have a bad culture. It's that when you have to make movies that translate easily between
Action
one
movies.
culture and another.
Action movies. But action movies back in the 80s also had an international audience primarily in terms of money making, and yet they were still much better.
Yeah.
They were.
That's true.
The Marvel movies are bad in comparison to like even Rambo.
But they had an international audience, but not a Chinese audience. The cultural difference was
didn't they start?
Big.
They started taking it in the 80s, I think.
Yeah, maybe you're right.
I don't know.
Well, I just feel like the dominance of that, at least it's a factor.
We're blaming China. Oh my God! Don't blame the poor Chinese.
I'm not blaming China. Look. I like the way I think of it is this: when you watch a movie from another country, another culture, the part of the appeal of it is that it requires more of you, that you have to
read subtitles.
You have to recognize when you don't have the context already, and that you have to think about what the context might be.
Yeah, foreign movies are art films for us.
Right. But that's why.
Require more thinking, yeah.
You're right. That's why. But when you try to make movies for a mass global audience that won't require them to.
And its lowest common denominator?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that might be part of it. Maybe the new Star Wars movies suck because they were made for...
They weren't that popular in China either.
Right. I think that they just sucked anyway.
Right? Well, I think that the reason they did well at all was because people had the cultural memory of Star Wars.
Yeah, that's right. It traded on nostalgia. That's right.
Yeah.
All around the world it did.
Right. Except for in places where it didn't, and it didn't do so well in those places. Right. Yeah, I'm not being anti-China here, or I'm just No.
I was just ribbing you. I mean, It's just one of these things where when we think about it culturally, who knows, right? Mm-hmm. But ideologically, meaning, I think we're already way down a highway of popular sentiment. It's very cynical. Mm-hmm. And nonetheless, there is this kind of new sincerity with the Zoomers. Mm-hmm. And Trump's part of that moment.
The millennials were also sincere.
Were they?
After 9/11, there was a big round of like, okay, we're in the post-irony era. We have to, David Foster Wallace even was like, he's trying to break from cynicism and all of that.
Our generation.
Right. But it was always wrong, because if we were going to be in a more sincere era, that didn't mean we were not going to be ironic and cynical.
Oh no, right. Well, maybe ironic and cynical would have to be distinguished.
Right, that's true.
Right. And this is actually what I didn't like about both Adam Curtis's hypernormalization and the David Shields treatment of Trump. Mm-hmm. Is the assimilation of Trump to postmodernism. I thought, well, there might be some truth to that. Again, him being an 80s figure. Mm-hmm. But in another respect, he was always discontented. He was always a dissident from that moment. Mm-hmm. And, he's also sort of shameless. Meaning, when you look at, I don't know, the way he's designed, the decor of the Oval Office, all the gold, everything's gold. And, what you realize is that it's flattering for people. Like, it makes people look better. It's like a warm glow, right? Because you're just like, what's this, all this gold? Actually, our backdrop is gold here, right? Our metropolis background here. But like, what the hell, right? But then you realize, it actually makes everybody more photogenic. There's actually a good reason for it, but there's nothing ironical about it.
No.
It's just like, this is what I like.
Yeah, and, but there was definitely there are ways in which Trump did play with irony throughout his media career.
Oh, you mean like K-fob, like WWE, right? and that kind of thing. He
I
performed.
remember a commercial he did for some phone company where he was taking a pottery classes like in the 80s or early 90s. And he's hitting on the woman next to him. And she's clearly turned off, doesn't like it at all. But he doesn't notice at all as he's trying to make a pot that just melts away. And yet he comes across like it's self-aware. There's a
Self-aware. Self-aware is different, right? Self-aware is different from everybody's just playing a part. It's more like with Trump, it's more like, well, of course I'm playing a part.
Right.
It isn't like, well, everything's just a mask. You know, you're always seeing behind the mask with Trump at the same time that you're seeing the mask.
Right. But isn't
You're not
that what
pretending that there's nothing.
If you have an ironic, like Bill Murray, he also is ironic, and you also feel like you're seeing behind the mask as well.
Sure. Bill Murray, though, I wouldn't put that in the same category. I would say that, you know, with a certain kind of postmodernism, and again, it's our generation. Our generation is the postmodernist generation. And the pathos of the postmodernists is that they were saying everything's a mask, but they were simultaneously protesting against it.
Right.
In saying it, they were protesting against it.
Yes.
Whereas I feel like it was taken up as everything's just a mask. And it's like the protest got lost.
Right. But that's why someone like Bill Murray was a countercultural figure even when he was big in mainstream, because of that distancing effect that he had.
Ghostbusters is an art film.
I think so.
Absolutely. It totally is.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So no, anyway, but I do feel, so when did it get taken up as everything's just a mask? And well, Baudrillard tried to theorize that way.
No, but he was a deep conservative that way. He was definitely protesting against it.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I think that what we're dealing with in our time is when, you know, there's like a mean edge to things now. I think that it's kind of like the, you know, no one is their true identity on the internet.
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, no one wants to put their actual name on anything. They want to do everything anonymously or pseudonymously. And I'm like, but how can you build a career that way? Right?
Right.
But maybe they don't want to build a career. Maybe they just want to, you know, be free for the rest of their lives to post pseudonymously.
Right.
You know, that's just different, right? And maybe you don't want your significant other to know about your online life at all.
Right.
You know, where it's like, you know?
Yeah. I mean, and then that has always been a part of the internet as well. But but I want to ask you one final question, and we should do the second half, which is when we start talking about the cultural and ideological changes that we might expect and how it happened, how it was in the past for our generation and the millennials and now the Zoomers, are we talking about working class culture? Or are we only talking about the culture of people like us, the intellectuals, the you know, how do we different? Do we need to wrangle? Do I need to wrangle with any of this shit at all to?
Well, again, I don't know that we can anticipate exactly. What I'd say is that what's the relationship between elite and popular culture at any moment in history? Right? So it's true that, you know, we live in a culture that's dominated by what Habermas complained about, a regime of experts. Right? And, you know, that it's like specialized cultural producers. And yet they have to find a market, they have to find what's appealing, you know. And so ultimately it does have to have a popular appeal, even if it's not actually produced by the people. Or it's only produced by the people insofar as they join the kind of cultural elite. You know, and then, you know, and obviously relies upon a great deal of authenticity mongering.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, I don't know, Jay-Z and Beyonce, you know,
Right.
whatever, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it both comes from the working class and it doesn't. In other words, it speaks to the condition while not being generated by the working class.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes time. That unfolds over decades.
Right. Well, I bring this up because I'm the new editor-in-chief of Sublation Magazine, which I see as an opportunity to rethink sublation overall. The campaign provided that opportunity to rethink sublation, and it did have a dramatic effect on mostly how I ran the Patreon. But now it's like, okay, what about the really, truly public-facing part of sublation? Right. And how do I want this to work? And can I look back on other left publications like Telos has floated around that we might want to be like Telos, or we might want to be like the New Left Review, or we might want to be, I thought, like Ramparts, or, this is different.
Yep.
And I was like, what I want to do is be like Sublation. Because I just kind of looked at the magazine as it is and said, everything I need is sort of already here.
There. Yep.
Yeah. But there's like a division thing that I'm still kind of wrestling with. So maybe we can talk about that in the parrot room. Yeah. Cool. And continue to talk about where things are after the Platypus Convention, and also the roles of like the campaign, sublation, platypus. Going forward. So I'm going to end it there, but I enjoyed this conversation. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.